past 4 years since my oldest daughter was born, I've come to realize kind of the ebbs and flows of trust. I guess I already was aware of those in my own life, but they've become perhaps more real, and I've connected with it a little bit better perhaps since Lainey was born. When she was a baby, she was completely reliant on Jennifer, as I'm sure many of y'all can relate, right? Our children as infants are completely reliant on us. Their trust in us is involuntary. Then she became a bit older. She started feeding herself. This is the stage that we're in with my youngest daughter. And while she was still very reliant on us, at some point there was this evolution from involuntary trust to voluntary trust. And that became most apparent at bedtime, when Lainey began to realize that there were shadows, right? And that mom and dad were not sleeping in the same room or even right outside her room with her. She felt alone, and shadows looked scary. She became much more aware of her surroundings and sounds as well. For her, these scary things were a new reality. And the abundance of trust that she once had in Jennifer and myself, it had all but vanished. We couldn't stop nightmares. We couldn't eliminate shadows. We weren't with her all night long. And what's interesting as I think about this is really, it's nothing that Jennifer and I did, right? We didn't do anything to lose her trust. It was simply the reality of life, right? It was the reality of life that made it much more difficult for her to trust us. Well, over the next several weeks, we're going to study the life of a guy named Hezekiah, a king over the nation of Judah, which was the southern kingdom of Israel. We'll get to that in just a minute. And we're going to see this theme of trust recur throughout this message series, but it's especially important, perhaps most important, in our text for today, and you will see why as we read this. So I invite you to turn with me to 2 Kings chapter 18, where we begin to read about Hezekiah. And while you're turning there, let me just go through a little bit of overview about 1st and 2nd Kings. So 1st and 2nd Kings kind of concludes a story of Israel that really, if we're looking back and trying to get a holistic view, it begins in the book of Genesis. And Genesis obviously teaches us a great deal, but about halfway through the book, Moses, as he's writing the book, he really hones in on this family. And the family is the family of Jacob, who was the son of Isaac, who was the son of Abraham. And you may recall that Jacob had a second name, and that name was what? It was Israel. And from Jacob came the entire nation of Israel. So we learn about this family in Genesis, and then we move to the book of Exodus. And actually we learn in Genesis how this family, how Israel's family finds themselves in Egypt. There was a famine in the land where they grew up, and they end up going to Egypt. You remember the story of Joseph, and he makes his way to Egypt. The family comes eventually after them, and while they're in Egypt, they do find food and are able to survive the famine, but more than that happens, they're there for a long time, and this family becomes a great people. It becomes a big nation. And obviously, you recall the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, he becomes very concerned about the size of the Hebrew people. So he begins to oppress them and enslave them. And eventually, we're introduced to a guy named Moses, who God uses to move the Israelites out of Egypt, where they wander around in the wilderness for 40 years. And then we get to the book, and that's all recorded in the book of Exodus. Then we get to the book of Joshua, and in Joshua is when they actually enter into the promised land. And there's a lot of battles, epic battles that happen as they are trying to take over the promised land. And they do. God told them he had this land for them, and they acquired the land through God's leading. They fought very hard to win this land. And then when we arrive at 1st and 2nd Kings, we see how and why Israel lost this very land that they once fought so hard to win. In the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, they focus on Israel's successes and failures, but they also teach us a great deal about the political climate of that time. And we're going to learn a little bit about that over the next few weeks. But they don't just teach us about the politics of that time. They don't just teach us about history. These books also teach us a great deal of theological truths. And they really stress the sovereignty of God over Israel and over other nations. So in 2 Kings, about midway through, we're introduced to this guy named Hezekiah, who was one of the kings of Judah. You may recall that, again, the nation of Israel was divided into two kingdoms, a northern kingdom, a southern kingdom. And this has been going on for a number of time. And the northern kingdom retained the name Israel, and the southern kingdom was called the nation of Judah. And Hezekiah was the king of Judah, so the southern kingdom. And when Hezekiah came to reign, the nation of Judah, the Assyrians, was kind of the great world power. However, again, as Hezekiah entered into kingship in Judah, the Assyrians, they were we'll just say preoccupied. They were preoccupied with the Babylonians and a couple other people groups, and they were trying to maintain their status as a great power, even though they were being perhaps challenged a little bit by the Babylonians. And so when all this was happening, the Assyrians had kind of backed off a little bit from their oppression or from their the governing that they did over the people of Judah. And this positioned Hezekiah in a place to where he could feel fairly safe to kind of push back against that Assyrian oppression. And so that's what we're going to read about here a little bit this morning. So let's begin our reading 2 Kings chapter 18 with verse 1. 2 Kings 18, verse 1. And this is what the text says. In the 3rd year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. And he was 25 years old when he became king. And he reigned in Jerusalem 29 years. His mother's name was Abijah, daughter of Zechariah. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. He removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. He broke into pieces the bronze snake Moses had made, for up to that time the Israelites had been burning incense to it. It was called Neheshutan. Hezekiah trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. And he held fast to the Lord and did not stop following him. He kept the commands the Lord had given Moses. And the Lord was with him. He was successful in whatever he undertook. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. From watchtower to fortified city, he defeated the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory. So let's stop there. In these verses, the author gives us some insight into the kind of person that Hezekiah was. First of all, we get some facts, right? He was 25 when he became king. It tells us that he was king for, I believe it was, 29 years. It tells us a little bit about his family, about his mom, about his dad, even about his mom's father. So we learn a little bit about that. But then we kind of get into some character, some descriptive, or a description of the character of Hezekiah. And we see, it tells us that he did right in the eyes of the Lord. In verse 5, it says, he trusted in the Lord. He held fast to the Lord. He didn't stop following him. He kept the commands of that the Lord had given to Moses. But notice also that in these verses, we don't just get this descriptive element of Hezekiah and his character. The author also gives us evidence of what he did. It said that he did right in the eyes of the Lord, and we see evidence of how he did this. We see this in, really, I would say verse 4 perhaps is the best example of that, where it tells us that he removed all the high places, he smashed the sacred stones, and he cut down the Asherah poles. He goes on to say he broke into pieces this bronze snake Moses had made. So he is doing his best to remove all the idolatrous symbols throughout the nation of Judah. We also see that he stopped submitting. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and chose not to serve him any longer. And I want to pose this question for you because this really helps us understand what is going on and why. And I want to ask, what is Hezekiah accomplishing in doing all these things? Like what is his ultimate goal? What is he doing with every idol he smashes? What is Hezekiah accomplishing? Well, Hezekiah, who trusted in the Lord, who believed the law of Moses, that God had believed the law that the Lord had given to Moses, Hezekiah's goal here is to re-centralize the worship of Yahweh, of God, for the people of Judah. He wants to bring them back to a place where they are obedient to God, where they are worshiping God. And we know that for the Israelites, it wasn't a matter of living life here, and then they had their religion here, and which unfortunately a lot of people in this world do, Christians probably included, unfortunately. It wasn't that they couldn't separate these things. Their worship of God was completely wrapped up in their identity, or that's how it was supposed to be. And so Hezekiah wants to bring those things back together. He wants to re-centralize the worship of Yahweh. He wants this to be a really big deal, and it should be. And we might really easily say, good for Hezekiah. That's really good. Glad to hear that he did this. This certainly is what made him such a good king. But I want you to think for a moment about how perhaps what Hezekiah was experiencing perhaps as he did this. What do you think it was like for Hezekiah as he went into different places throughout the region of Judah and he took away these idols that people used as worship, for worship? What do you think happened when he told his people that he was going to stop giving in to the Assyrian king? What do you think happened? I imagine there was a lot of fear. There's probably a lot of pushback. Some of them may have felt like he had pulled the rug right out from under them. What would it have been like for Hezekiah? What would it be like for you to lead a large group of people into changing who they worshiped and how they went about doing that? I imagine for Hezekiah it was a pretty lonely place at times. Although he is considered one of the greatest kings in Israel's history, I do wonder if perhaps in that moment, in this time, if those people really believed that. They're probably upset with him. He probably wasn't real popular. And I think that leads us to ask another question. And the question is, what motivated Hezekiah to initiate such reform there in Judah? I think conviction absolutely played a role in this, right? He's convicted by the fact that his people, who he is leading, they are not doing what they're supposed to do. I imagine Hezekiah was well acquainted with the Torah, the Old Testament law, and the stories in it, namely the story of the exit of his people out of Egypt and how God just miraculously provided for them and took care of them. He's probably well acquainted with this, and he knows the law that God gave to Moses, and he wants to bring his people back to a place where that law is central to who they were. He was convicted of this, but I think that conviction alone isn't enough for Hezekiah to lead this nation back to a place where God is the center of this nation. I think there's more. And we really see it in the text. In verse 5, it tells us that Hezekiah trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel. You see, trust is absolutely essential. I want to ask you, what does it take to trust God? It's really a simple statement, trust in the Lord. It's a simple statement, but it carries a lot of weight. King Solomon tells us in the book of Proverbs, he calls his readers to trust in the Lord with all your what? All your heart. He goes on and says, and lean not on your own understanding. Most of you have certainly heard these words. Maybe you've even been really intentional about applying them to your lives. But there comes a point in all of our lives when our trust of God is met with reality. And the two of those things collide. And the question is, what wins that collision? What comes out on the winning side of that collision? And for most of us, this collision happens numerous times throughout our life. Sometimes it's a small collision, sometimes it's a massive collision. For my daughter, trusting her mom and dad became much more difficult when she became aware of potentially scary things. Trusting us became much more challenging when she knew we couldn't eliminate shadows and we couldn't prevent nightmares. Similarly, our trust of God is challenged when we become aware of scary things. When nightmarish things happen to us, it becomes hard to trust in God. Today is 9/11. When we observed the events on 9/11 in 2001, our trust collided with reality. The trust that many believers had collided with the reality that our nation had been attacked and thousands of people have lost their lives. When we lose our job, or when we lose a child or a parent or a family member or a friend, when our minds begin to wander down paths that lead to anxiety and depression, when a loved one is diagnosed with some horrible illness, reality collides with our trust in God. And I feel confident that some of you have probably experienced some other type of unforeseen circumstance that really suddenly came crashing into the trust that you have or perhaps had of God. This was something that the nation of Israel had experienced on numerous occasions. And as I think about that, I go back to the book of Exodus, because I think the illustration, the imagery here is really helpful when we're talking about this collision between trust and reality. You remember, after the 10 plagues happen, Pharaoh tells Israel, get out of here. I'm tired of you. This is awful. You need to leave. He finally relents and lets them go. And the Israelites, I imagine they're excited to get out of Egypt, and they go down and they're making their way to the wilderness. Moses is leading them. Actually, God is leading Moses. They're following Moses. And they get down to a place called the Red Sea, and they set up camp there. And I don't know if you've ever gone camping, but if you go camping with me, you know it takes a while to set up and take down camp. It takes some time. It's not a quick process. And so they get down there, they're camping, when all of a sudden they look back up, and I kind of envision them looking up this hill when they see Pharaoh and this massive army coming after them with swords drawn, coming after them. And I imagine in that moment they're like, oh, wow, this is not a good situation to be in. Our backs are to the Red Sea, and we have the Egyptian army coming after us, ready for battle. What are we going to do? No, they really didn't have another choice. They had to trust the Lord, right? They were going to die or they weren't going to die. And if they weren't going to die, it was going to be a miracle. And we know it was a miracle, right? The Lord parted the Red Sea. The Israelites walked through. They get through. The army of Egypt comes in after them. And then the waters of the sea close and all of the Egyptian army drowns, right? You know the story. It's miraculous. You see, for the Israelites, God had protected them. He delivered them from the hands of the Egyptians. Their trust of God, it collided with reality. And in this case, God provided a miracle. He provided the miraculous. And maybe you've experienced that. Maybe you've had a situation where God provided, your trust in God and reality collided, and God somehow provided some unforeseen, some unexpected miracle, and man, it just deepened your trust of God. But I want to ask you, what happens if you don't get that miracle? Will we trust God whether He provides that miracle or not? I feel pretty confident that, again, Hezekiah was well aware of God's many past deliverances of Israel, and perhaps this strengthened his trust in God. And it was this trust in God that led him to redirect the nation of Judah and centralize the worship of Yahweh. It was this trust in God that led Hezekiah to rebel against the king of Assyria and refuse to serve him. So what happens when that trust meets reality? For Hezekiah, let's keep reading. Verse 9. 2 Kings 18, verse 9. In King Hezekiah's 4th year, which was the 7th year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, marched against Samaria and laid siege to it. At the end of 3 years, the Assyrians took it, so Samaria was captured in Hezekiah's 6th year, which was the 9th year of Hoshea, king of Israel. Verse 11. The king of Assyria deported Israel to Assyria and settled them in Hala, in Gozan, on the Habor River, and in towns of the Medes. This happened because they had not obeyed the Lord their God, but had violated his covenant. All that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded, they neither listened to the commands nor carried them out. We're going to stop there. I know your bulletin says we're going to keep going, but we're going to stop there for today. So let me, again, recap just a bit of the historical details here. Remember, there was a northern kingdom called Israel. There was a southern kingdom called Judah. Hezekiah was king of the southern kingdom. This guy named Hoshea, as we are introduced to here, he is the king of the northern kingdom, Israel. And within the northern kingdom is an area of Samaria. We read about Samaria and the Samaritans in the New Testament a bit. But there's an area of Samaria. These are Israelites who are living there. And we see that King Shalmaneser, the king of Assyria, decides he's going to come and he's going to attack the northern kingdom. And he does this while Hezekiah is in his 4th year as king of Judah. And so what we learn here is that while Hezekiah has been busy reforming the nation of Judah and centralizing the worship of Yahweh and rejecting the Assyrian power, the king of Assyria, Shalmaneser, and his army, they are attacking Samaria. And 3 after they attack Samaria, they capture it, and they take the Israelites living in Samaria and in the northern kingdom, they take them captive and take them back to Assyria. And when this happened, the king of Assyria again, I imagine when this happened, Hezekiah begins to wonder or think, or he takes note. And what's really interesting, if we back up a chapter and go to 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 1 through 6, we see here the political reasons for Assyria's attack on Israel. And it tells us there that Hoshea, the king of Israel, had revolted against the Assyrians. He refused to pay them tribute or sending ransom money, whatever you want to call it. And he had also sent envoys to the Egyptian king. So essentially, Hoshea, the king of Israel, has refused to pay the Assyrians what they wanted to be paid. And he is simultaneously trying to build an ally with Egypt. And obviously, we see this happen even today globally. In the global political world, there's different allies. And this country doesn't want you to become friends with this country because that poses a bigger threat to that country. And that's essentially what's happening here. Shalmaneser, the king of Assyria, does not want Hoshea and the Israelites, the northern kingdom, to become allies with the Egyptians because that makes them a bigger power. So he attacks them. This is the political reason for this attack. But we need to recognize the really important, what's I think more important for our purposes, the theological reason for this. And that is found in verse 12 where it says, this happened because they did not obey the Lord their God, but they had violated his covenant. The fundamental reason Samaria fell was not political, but was rather because their spiritual rebellion had led God to allow the Assyrian king Shalmaneser and his army to attack the northern kingdom of Israel. There is a clear cause and effect here. The Israelites were disobedient to God, and God allowed the Assyrians to come in and conquer Samaria and take the people captive. And although it's not specifically stated, I think there's a very clear implication in verse 12 tells us, and that implication is that had the northern kingdom of Israel, had they centralized the worship of God, had they made him king, had they made him Lord, then this wouldn't have happened. But there's also an implication for Hezekiah in the southern kingdom. Because Hezekiah had been obedient to God, and because he had issued these reforms, and because the nation of Judah had re-centralized the worship of Yahweh, then they, in essence, should not have to face the same reality as the northern kingdom. Verses 9 through 12 illustrate for us that Hezekiah could not live in disobedience to the Lord and survive. But the question that kind of remains unanswered at this point in the text is whether or not Hezekiah can serve the Lord, disobey Assyria, and survive. One could hope that perhaps this is the case. Hopefully Hezekiah's obedience in the Lord will result in the protection from the Assyrian people. But I want to ask you, what if it doesn't? What if Hezekiah's trust in the Lord doesn't provide protection for the nation of Judah? What then? Now we're going to stop our reading here in verse 12. And I want to kind of wrap all this up by just giving you some things to think about. Maybe you're in a season where trusting God is really easy. Things are going well, and it's not hard to trust the Lord. That's awesome if you're in that season. I wish more people were experiencing that season. But I imagine there's a lot of people here whose trust in God has collided with a nightmarish reality. Whatever that reality is, a lost job, loss of a loved one, divorce, illness, you name it. And I want to tell you what happens when these two things collide. When our trust with God collides with a bad, nightmarish reality, that collision happens, we lose clarity. We lose the ability to understand. And I think King Solomon clearly understood that this was the way all of this worked out. When reality faced our trust or collided with our trust in God, he understood that we lose understanding because he says that. He says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and what? Lean not on your own understanding. You see, when trusting God collides with the conflicting reality, the biggest issue we have is that it often doesn't make sense. And we begin to question God. And I want you to understand, there's nothing wrong with asking questions of God. There's nothing wrong with saying, God, why did this happen? God, why did you allow that to happen? God, what are you doing? I don't understand. There's nothing wrong with asking those questions. In fact, those questions can often draw us closer to God. But what becomes a problem is when we allow those questions to redirect our belief or our trust in God. See, when our trust in God collides with reality, we lose understanding, we lose clarity. When we ask those questions, God, why did you allow this to happen? We get angry or frustrated with him for not answering them. It becomes very clear that what we are hoping to do is we are hoping to lean on our own understanding. We are seeking clarity. I don't often read a lot of illustrations that I read online, but I want to conclude this sermon by reading a story about a guy named John Kavanaugh, who is a famous ethicist. Apparently, I'd never heard of him. Maybe you have. If you have, well done. But John Kavanaugh, he goes to Calcutta and he seeks out Mother Teresa. And he goes there for 3 months to work at a place called the House of the Dying, and he's doing this in hopes of finding out how he could spend the rest of his life. And it says when he met Mother Teresa, he asked her to pray for him. And she says, well, what do you want me to pray for? He then uttered the request that he had carried thousands of miles. And he says, clarity. Pray that I have clarity. No, Mother Teresa responded. She said, I will not do that. And when he asked her why, she said, clarity is the last thing you are clinging to. It's the last thing that you must let go of. And when Kavanaugh said that she always seemed to have clarity, the very kind of clarity he was looking for, Mother Teresa laughed and said, I've never had clarity. What I have always had is trust. So I will pray that you trust God. Friends, when your reality collides with your ability to trust in God, may you and we together reject the temptation to seek understanding and to find clarity. May we instead choose to lean into the only one who is always trustworthy, Christ Jesus. May we lean into his promises together. Amen.